All right, so let's bring it back here. Post-war Germany. Mr. Ellenbecker talked about the attempt to come to moral and ethical terms to crimes against humanity and the death toll of the Second World War and the ugliness of the Third Reich Nazi regime and racial policies and so forth. What I'd like to talk about is what happens to Germany politically and materially after the war. This was a big question. Germany was an economic powerhouse of Central Europe. Much of the European economic system revolved around Germany. What was it going to look like in the years and decades after German defeat? Well, this question was sought after in two conferences that occur in the waning months of World War II. One is going to be called the Yalta Conference. That's going to be the last conference that Franklin Roosevelt attends in his life. It happens in February of 1945. It's portrayed up here. You've probably seen this picture before. Roosevelt is 2 months from dying. This is February of 45. He dies in April of a brain hemorrhage. And he meets with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, and there's an attempt to kind of hammer out what post-war Germany and what post-war Europe is going to look like. And while some conclusions are drawn, there's a lot of stuff yet to be determined. One thing that's determined is that Germany would be divided into sectors, administrative sectors, one controlled by the Soviet Union, one by the Americans, one by the British, and then eventually the Soviets agreed that the French could have a small administrative sector that's carved out of the British and the Americans. I'll show you a graphic of that in a second. Also, this idea that Germans should be forced to pay some reparations. That's a very much up in the air question because the Soviet Union is doing most of the heavy lifting in fighting the German army. 80% of the German Wehrmacht is deployed against the Soviet Union in the East. Yes, the Americans and the British are fighting the Germans, but comparatively less. And they've been doing it for a shorter time. So the Soviet Union feels they should be able to extract whatever they want from the German people in the sense that Germany invaded them and committed major atrocities against the Soviet Union and the people of Eastern Europe. Later on, another conference is held at what is called Potsdam. This is not attended by Franklin Roosevelt because he dies in April. His successor, Harry Truman, meets with those same characters, Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill, and they come to some more concrete plans on how the German economy would be restructured after the war. Most notably, they would be demilitarized. They would have to have their industrial sector retooled, and they'd have to share important raw materials like coal and steel and so forth, and that gets laid out there. At all of this, there's a lot of mistrust between the Soviets and the Americans. The Soviets, from their perspective, feel as though they have done most of the sacrifice, and this is kind of borne out in the facts. The Soviet Union loses over 20 million people. They do most of the fighting longer than the Americans or the British do, at least in Western Europe. And the Soviets fear capitalist encirclement. They were the only communist nation before the war, and the capitalist democracies did not really like them, did not really treat them well, so they were very fearful of what their intentions were. Would they become encircled by capitalist markets, and would they have to fight for everything they had to uphold their communist ideology? They weren't sure. On top of all of that, the U.S. is very uncertain about what the Soviet intentions might be. They know Joseph Stalin is the murderous dictator in charge of the Soviet Union. They knew what he did during the 1930s. They knew about the purges. They knew about collectivizations. They knew about mass starvations of, places like Ukraine. There was no mystery on what Stalin was capable of. And now he was in charge of half of Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and a huge chunk of industrial Germany was now firmly in the grips of the Soviet military. What were they going to do? That question was yet to be resolved. Were they going to allow free and fair elections? Were they going to allow the free movement of people? Were they going to try to extract maximum gain? Who knew? The Soviets also, at the time, exact brutal treatment of German civilians in the areas that they encounter. There's all sorts of horrific stories that go on to German civilians, mass rape of German women, some histories of this recorded in the hundreds of thousands or even into over 1 million. Other acts of atrocities of mass starvation and other brutal treatment occur there. It's one of those differences between history and memory. If we were living through this time period, that would probably be the emotive things that we were thinking about. But now we look at the broader political narrative because we know how the story unfolds. But at the time, this would have been the all-consuming thought of people. Just to show you a graphic, this is what Europe looks like at the end of the Second World War. Wherever you see there is red, that's the area where the Soviet military is firmly in control of. They fought for it, they took it, they're not going anywhere at this time. That includes all of these countries. The areas in blue are the areas that the capitalist democracies have nominal control over. That's France, West Germany, Italy. Spain's a little bit of an exception because the Franco regime was neutral. United Kingdom, Norway. Some of the areas in white, like Yugoslavia, they push the Germans out on their own. There's some other areas like Switzerland and Austria that fall into a different camp. Take a look at this. This is Germany after the war, just so you have a visual. You've probably seen this in US too, but this is what the administrative division of Germany looks like initially. Now, there's no immediate conclusion that Germany is going to become two countries. That's not established till 1949. More on that in a bit. But the Soviets will administer this chunk of eastern Germany, and that was a very industrial-rich region. Also, the Americans are going to get a large chunk of the south. This would be the area that includes the city of Munich. It's why if you go to Germany today and you go to the city of Munich, you can find English spoken almost everywhere. You don't have to strain yourself at all. France is going to get some borderland regions, and the UK is going to get a northern chunk of Germany, where the US takes control of some of the important strategic port cities like Hamburg and others. Reparations, going to be a big question. Nobody knows exactly what the Soviets are going to take from Germany. Again, from their perspective, they were invaded, they defeated Germany. One stat for you, this one always stood out to me. Just to take the capital city of Berlin, the Soviets lose over 100,000 people just to take one city in the final month of the war. So when they storm into East Germany, they're thinking about how can we recover? If we need war supplies, if we need factory materials, industrial equipment, we're taking it. If we have access to engineers and scientists and other valuable materials and support, we're taking it. So if you are an engineer in Germany, you might just get culled up by the Russian forces and sent back to the Soviet Union, and you're not coming back. There are other stories about entire factories being disassembled, put on rail cars, and sent back to the Soviet Union. They're there in many ways for compensation. Berlin is going to be kind of a weird story in all of this because if you look on the graphic, the capital city of Berlin is deep within the Soviet administrative sector. It's going to be divided here into all of the victorious Allied powers, which means the Americans, the British, and the French are going to have rights and access to that city. And it raises the question, how do they get there? How do they keep it supplied? There's going to be land corridor routes that allow them to, but it raises the question, what if the Soviets just shut off those land access routes? What if they do? Do we have a backup plan? How will that be dealt with? We'll come to that in a bit. Here's what I'd like you to do. I want to show you this British newsreel from 1945, and I like looking at old-timey black and white newsreels because they're constructed for mass audiences, and they represent something from the time period. So what we're looking at here is a historical artifact, and I want you to look at it as such. So pick one word that the British newsreel wants you to conclude about the Yalta Conference, that conference that the Allies attended to decide what to do with post-war Germany. And why did you choose this word? Again, look at this as a historical artifact.
To the Big Three Conference in the Crimea went not only the leaders of the three great Allied powers, but also the hopes and faith of all men who look to a future free from war. A ship carrying members of the British delegation approaches the Crimea. Within sight of Sebastopol Harbor, a Russian pilot takes over on the bridge. The venue for this most momentous conference of the war is Yalta, one of Russia's most popular peacetime holiday resorts, summer and winter. The actual meetings were held in the Lovadia Palace, 2.5 miles outside Yalta, a former residence of the Tsars. This region was badly damaged in the great battles which liberated the Crimea, but and many houses were restored to accommodate the delegates. Welcoming the Allied leaders at the airport is Mr. Molotov, the Soviet Commissar for Foreign Affairs, here seen greeting General Alexander and others. Among the early arrivals are Mr. Eden and Mr. Sustinius, American Secretary of State. Courtesies include a march past by Soviet guards. Mr. Roosevelt and Mr. Churchill, old acquaintances of the Russian leaders, renew the friendship forged at Tirana. The LaGuardia Palace, however brilliant its functions in Imperial Russia, never housed so memorable a meeting as this. The decisions reached here have to square up to the bedrock aspirations of the people of the United Nations and prove worthy of their cause. First to arrive is the warrior statesman Joseph Stalin. Mr. Churchill, wearing a shapka, seems to have picked up a bit of local color. Traditional headgear of the Caucasian mountaineers, it added to the PM's already extensive collection of hats. Here is the start of the most important of all roundtable conferences. In this room, the future of Germany was hammered out. Says the Crimea Declaration, we are determined to disarm and disband all German armed forces, to break up for all time the German General Staff, remove or destroy all German military equipment, eliminate or control all German industry that could be used for military production, bring all war criminals to justice and swift punishment, and exact reparation in kind. These were the precise terms behind every meeting that took place in those 8 crowded days in Yalta.
Take a moment, discuss with a partner. What word would you choose to describe how this newsreel wants you to conclude about the Yalta Conference? What do they want to convey? What do we got? What's one word that you get from this footage? One word and why you choose it. Yeah. Okay, monumental. It's a major achievement. Any other words that come to mind? Let's hear from one more. Yeah. Forward thinking. Why did you choose that one? Okay, yeah. As you guys say, monumental forward thinking. This is kind of a peppy newsreel. The music, the sort of optimism. It doesn't talk about division or uncertainty or clouds of despair or whatever else you could have reasonably concluded had you actually been there. Because if you were actually there and not just watching the newsreel, you'd realize there's some deep divisions about the future of democracy in Eastern Europe and the future of communism and capitalism and, you know, the fact that there are 2 superpowers left and much of the world is kind of, you know, up in the air in terms of how it's going to develop. But at the time, this was the message that was projected by the international press. Problems after the war. I'm going to oscillate here between talking from the U.S. perspective and the Soviet perspective. Right here, these are problems from the American perspective. Number one, communism threatens half of Europe. You saw that map. The Soviet military is in control of half of it, and there's really not a whole lot anybody's going to be able to do. The Soviet army is gigantic. The American army is comparatively small. The British army is even smaller and weaker and doesn't have the financial support. So there's really no counter to that. At the same time, people are looking at the threat of communism as a real sinister thing for the future. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, he gives a speech in 1946. He calls the Soviet control of Eastern Europe an iron curtain. He says an iron curtain has descended upon Europe, from northern to southern Europe. This is some dark language at the time. Germany is divided. That's going to be a problem. Who's going to oversee that division, and is there going to be any attention to the goodwill of civilians at the time? And another big problem is, how do you get Western Europe, the part that the capitalist democracies control, how do you get them to cooperate on things of economic value? Like, how do they share access to coal and steel, and how do they grow their economy, especially when large chunks of the infrastructure are destroyed? Who's going to pay for that? All of these questions are swirling at the time. So there is an attempt to deal with this in a constructive manner, and that is with what's called the Marshall Plan. You guys probably addressed this in US too, so I won't belabor it too much. I'll show you a clip on it just to refresh your mind. The Marshall Plan is an attempt to rebuild Western Europe after the war. Much of the Soviet sector is going to be disallowed from participating in this because the Soviets see it as sort of a capitalist attempt to ensnare the people of Eastern Europe into their markets and their consumer goods. Access to Berlin is going to be another big problem after the war. How are the British, the French, and the Americans going to access this city deep in the heart of the Soviet sector? What happens if the Soviets start being difficult about it? Are you willing to risk a war over this? I mean, those are questions people are grappling with. And how do you stop the spread of communism beyond what it already has kind of entrenched itself in? All of those Eastern European countries are now likely going to form communist government. How do you limit it from there? Here's what I want to just remind you of, the Marshall Plan, because this is probably the most substantive policy to come out of post-war Europe and post-war Germany at the time. So here's the question. What's the biggest consequence of the Marshall Plan? Meaning result, and why?
Hooray! World War II is over, but Europe is in ruins. What can a country like the United States do to help? How about setting aside over $13 billion to help rebuild the smoldering continent? That's what the European Recovery Plan, aka the Marshall Plan, sought to do. Restore the European economy by giving foreign aid to countries that needed it. It was a brilliant move to win the peace by George C. Marshall, the plan's creator. Marshall had been a career military man, and during the war had served as the Army's chief of staff. He oversaw the U.S. military strategy and was one of the key figures behind the Allied victory. Marshall retired from the Army at the end of the war, but President Truman valued his brains too much. After serving as the ambassador to China, Marshall was appointed Secretary of State in early 1947. Soon after, he developed his European Recovery Plan and announced it in June of that year. From April 1948 to December 1951, the United States shipped food, fuel, machinery, and money to European countries. The goal was to help them get back on their feet after the devastation of the war. In one sense, this was good deed foreign policy. The United States was being a friend, using its considerable resources to help war-torn Europe. Plus, the last time the world left a conquered nation in ruins, Nazi Germany rose to power. But there were other reasons to implement the Marshall Plan as well. By investing in the economies of European countries, the U.S. helped create new markets for its exports. Perhaps we could interest you in a Buick. There was a strategic objective, too. The U.S. wanted to isolate the Soviet Union, to keep it from expanding its sphere of influence beyond Eastern Europe. How better to make capitalism appealing than to spread around money in a war-torn country? By the way, here are all the countries that received Marshall Plan aid in alphabetical order. Ready? Austria, Belgium, Denmark, France, Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and West Germany. Now, if you listen closely, you might have noticed a couple of major European countries that weren't on that list. The USSR didn't trust the U.S. intentions with the Marshall Plan and forbade Poland and Czechoslovakia from receiving American aid. Too bad for them, because the plan worked. The gross national product of Marshall Plan countries grew as much as 25%. It put Western European industry back on its feet. The American export economy boomed, and Soviet-influenced communism was contained to Eastern Europe. Nice work, George Marshall. In 1953, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. The greater honor for Marshall, though, may have been seeing Europe rise from the ashes, thanks in part to the plan that bears his name.
Take 30 seconds, chat with a partner. What was the biggest consequence, outcome of the Marshall Plan in your view? Take a moment, we'll share that out. What's one big consequence of the Marshall Plan? Who can share that out, in your judgment? We got to get some new volunteers here. This is not a heavy lift. Mr. Ellenbecker, who do you want to volunteer? I know.
Peter, let's hear from you.
Yeah. Biggest consequence of it. What's that? You didn't get one. How about another one?
Morgan,
Go ahead, Libby. Libby volunteered here. I want to give her some priority, and then we'll hear from Morgan. Go ahead.
The Soviet Union, the whole plan, backfired on them, and then communism was contained.
Yeah, okay, it contains communism. It builds up the non-communist elements of Europe. Absolutely. I don't know which Morgan he was referring to, but go ahead. Nothing else? How does it benefit the United States? Go ahead.
It supplies the economy and makes it bigger.
Yeah, it provides markets to the United States. All of our consumer goods can then go to Europe. There's brand loyalty that's established in relationships, economic and otherwise. So all around, it's kind of a win-win, and Marshall kind of goes down as a major American statesman. And for his part, he was a military guy who kind of became an international statesman as a result of this. This is where the aid goes. It goes to the UK in a big way, France, West Germany. West Germany's not immediately created yet. It will eventually be created. And Italy. Britain is going to benefit greatly from this because they're basically bankrupt after the war. It is going to allow them to develop their social and economic programs in a big way. So I want to address this. What were West and East Germany? You've probably heard of these terms before. How did they come into existence? Well, West Germany is what gets created in 1949 when the Americans, the British, and the French realize that the Soviets are going their own direction with communist Eastern Europe. So they merge their zones together to create what's called the Federal Republic of Germany. This is a country from 1949 to 1990. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, Germany gets reunified in 1990-91, and it's the Germany we have today. But for a while, it's a portion of it is its own separate country. It's backed by the USA. It's a capitalist democracy. It's supposed to be kind of the shining example of what the capitalist world can offer. And not to be outdone, the Soviet Union props up East Germany and creates its own country there called the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. That's going to exist during the same amount of time, 49 to 1990. It's backed by the USSR, it forms a communist government, and it's seen as kind of a shining light of what communism can be. Both sides use these nations as proxy examples of their ideological and political and economic systems. The Olympics get very competitive between these two, and both sides kind of see Germany as a reflection of them. So what's the U.S. strategy and policy overall? I'm going to blend a bunch of terms together here. The overall strategy in the Cold War, and Germany's a big part of this, is that strategy of containment. You talked about this in US too to a great degree, so I won't belabor it. But the idea is war with the Soviet Union would be suicidal. They're a superpower. They're going to have nuclear weapons within a couple years after the Second World War. So isolate them, contain their growth, don't let communism spread. Also, create a mutual defense pact of all the non-communist nations called NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It looks like this. All those areas in tan orange will be banded together into a mutual defense pact called NATO. It will be expanded in the 1990s. That enrages Russia. It's one of the major foreign policy disputes between Russia and the US today. Russia will say, why did you expand NATO after we stopped being the Soviet Union? And there isn't really a solid answer to that entirely. The Truman Doctrine, this is kind of the first example of the Cold War in action. It's a policy by President Harry Truman to basically give military aid and economic support to any nation that resists the spread of communism. So if there's a communist revolution going on in your country, the US will give you money and support. This is first tried in Greece and then in Turkey. Truman is going to pulse weapons and funds into those nations so they do not fall to communism. The overall big goal when you factor all of these together is stabilize the capitalist democracy world. make it look good. Make it be a shining light of that system. Don't let it fall to communism. We still got over a minute and a half, so please don't pack up. Some organizations are created to kind of prop this up. One is the International Monetary Fund, the other is the World Bank, and the idea, these are other examples of how money can be gotten to places in the world to stabilize them so they don't become, despaired regions that fall to communism. So this raises this final question I want to pose. How far should the U.S. go? What if there is a confrontation? What if there is a real showdown with the capitalist communist world? Well, this happens in 1948-49. It's called the Berlin Blockade and Airlift, where the Soviet Union cuts off access to Berlin for the Western democracies, Britain, France, and the USA. The U.S., not to let this kind of sink into the Soviet sector, decides to airdrop supplies to Berlin, West Berlin that is, for over a year. This is an incredible feat, economically speaking. At one point in 1949, a plane is landing in West Germany every 60 seconds. And this isn't just like consumer goods and some basic food. This is coal drops. This is fuel. This is hospital materials, expertise, and so forth. And it's the first example of just how far the U.S. is willing to go. Thanks for sticking with me. I'll see you later.